In the cold December of 2005, the quiet city of Russellville, Arkansas, was unsettled by a silence that should not have existed. Nona Dirksmeyer, 19 years old, a pageant queen and a college student with a radiant presence, stopped answering her phone. She vanished, not into the night, but into a silence that weighed heavier than absence. She had been known for her kindness, for her advocacy against child abuse, for the bright smile that softened even the hardest spaces. And then, without warning, her light dimmed. Her boyfriend, Kevin Jones, noticed first. The unanswered calls, the messages that went unread. He told himself she was busy, perhaps sleeping, but unease grew with every hour. Kevin's mother sensed it too, the quiet unease of something pressing in from the edges. Together they went to Nona's small apartment, its door closed, its windows drawn. The December air hung heavy with frost, muffling sound, pressing silence into every shadow. The building smelled faintly of dust and heating vents. Inside the hallway, fluorescent lights flickered, leaving stuttering shadows on the wall. Kevin hesitated before the door, his chest, tight palms damp. His mother's voice was calm but firm. Knock. He did. No answer. He tried again, harder. The silence pressed back. Finally, the door gave way. The apartment was still. The faint scent of iron lingered beneath the ordinary smell of laundry detergent and stale food. A lamp lay, shattered its fragments, scattered like teeth across the living room floor. And there, in the center of it, was Nona. Her body was twisted in silence, her skin pale, her clothes stained with blood that had seeped into the carpet. The broken lamp, now jagged, bore its own dark story, its base smeared, its edges sharp. A knife had done the rest. Kevin fell to his knees, his voice caught, strangled between disbelief and grief. He reached for her, held her, felt the chill of skin that had already turned. His mother screamed, her sound splitting the silence that had held the building captive. Blood spread onto Kevin's shirt, his arms, his hands. Outside the city of Russellville went about its evening unaware that within this apartment a mystery had begun. The kind and promising life of Nona Dirksmeyer had ended in violence. And in that moment, with Kevin cradling her body, the suspicion of guilt had already begun to form. The room seemed to tilt as Kevin Jones crouched on the carpet, his arms wrapped around Nona's lifeless body. The smell of copper was overwhelming, thick in the back of his throat, mixing with the faint scent of detergent clinging to her clothes. His chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked bursts. The world narrowed to the chill of her skin against his, the stickiness of blood that clung and would not let go. His mother's trembling hands fumbled for the phone. Her voice cracked as she called emergency services, each word a struggle against disbelief. Kevin barely heard her. His ears roared with his own pulse, and his eyes could not leave Nona's face, pale, distant, emptied of the warmth he had known only hours before. The apartment bore the signs of violence that words could scarcely contain. The lamp, once whole, once ordinary, was shattered into a weapon. Its jagged edge had been turned cruel, its base heavy with impact. Dark stains marked the carpet and wall, a pattern of rage written in blood. Near her body lay a knife, its blade reflecting the dull light of the ceiling fixture, smeared with what no one wanted to believe. When paramedics arrived, the apartment filled with motion. Gloves, snapped voices called out, footsteps shuffled across the small living room. Kevin was pulled away, his hand still reaching for her, his shirt and arms drenched in evidence. The paramedics' voices were brisk-clipped. They confirmed what Kevin already knew. Nona Dirksmeyer was gone. The officers arrived moments later and the air shifted. The urgency of medical response gave way to the cold precision of investigation. Their eyes swept the room with practiced detachment. They noted the blood, the lamp, the knife, and the man still streaked with crimson. Kevin's grief-filled collapse was read in silence, measured as fact. His words, "I found her like this," echoed in the sterile air, but the weight of his blood-stained clothing spoke louder. As flashbulbs lit the living room, documenting every angle, the scene transformed from home to evidence. Nona's body was no longer only a daughter's or a girlfriend's, it became Exhibit 1. Kevin's embrace, intended as a final gesture of love, now bound him to suspicion. In the eyes of investigators, no one else had been there. What lay unseen was the shadow of another presence, a trace not yet recognized, silent but waiting to be uncovered. The first hours of an investigation are unforgiving. Officers measure grief not as human suffering, but as potential deception. Kevin Jones, 19 years old, stood in the center of that harsh scrutiny. His shirt clung to him, soaked with Nona's blood. His hands bore stains that no amount of scrubbing could explain away. His voice cracked under the weight of shock, yet every tremor was catalogued, every misplaced glance filed away as evidence. The detectives did not need to look far for a suspect. Kevin had discovered the body. Kevin had touched her. Kevin had altered the scene. In their eyes, grief was indistinguishable from guilt. They pressed him with questions before the night had fully ended. Where had he been? Why had he come? What did they argue about last? His answers faltered, not because he was hiding something, but because the images of Nona's broken form still replayed behind his eyes, each memory colliding with the next. Neighbors whispered as officers escorted him from the apartment. Their voices carried speculation. The boyfriend always does it. In true crime, the closest person is often the most likely. Kevin knew this, but knowledge did little to shield him from the cold stares that followed. His mother walked behind him, her face rigid with fear not only of what had happened to Nona, but of what was already happening to her son. At the station, the process was clinical. Clothing bagged, photographs taken. His hands swabbed for traces he could not explain away. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Kevin felt less like a grieving boyfriend and more like a specimen. Hours blurred into one another, the line between reality and nightmare dissolving. His grief had become their proof. The detectives built their theory quickly. Kevin's relationship with Nona, though steady on the surface, was framed as tumultuous. They painted him as jealous, controlling, quick to anger. Each pause in his responses was treated as strategy. Each shake of his head was interpreted as denial, not disbelief. The scene had offered them a simple story: rage, a broken lamp, a knife. A young man's jealousy turned deadly. But the truth is rarely simple. Beneath the surface of their assumptions, the apartment still held secrets, objects misplaced, details ignored. Silent breadcrumbs that pointed elsewhere, though in this moment, no one cared to see them. The interrogation room was windowless, painted in muted grey, the kind of colour chosen to drain warmth from memory. Kevin sat at a metal table, bolted to the floor, his hands trembling against the cold surface. A camera's red light glowed steadily from the corner, a silent reminder that every blink, every hesitation would be preserved forever. The detectives began with calm voices. They asked about the day, what time he last spoke to Nona, where he had gone, why he chose to come by with his mother. Each question sounded harmless at first, but each was designed to tighten a noose. Kevin's answers wavered. His mind returned again and again to the blood on his hands, to the stillness of Nona's body. The more he faltered, the more convinced the detectives became that guilt was buried in his pauses. Hours passed. Their voices hardened, accusations sharpened. They suggested that Nona had angered him, that a fight had escalated, that rage had driven him to use the lamp. They placed photographs before him. Nona's lifeless form, the broken glass, the knife, slick with blood. His throat closed, his voice cracked. "I didn't hurt her." The words echoed against walls that absorbed them and returned nothing. Then came the polygraph. Wires were attached. Sensors tightened around his chest and fingers. He was instructed to remain still, to breathe evenly, to answer only yes or no. But grief is not steady. Trauma does not follow rhythm. When the machine printed its lines of jagged ink, the examiner shook his head. The result was failure. For detectives already convinced of his guilt, it was confirmation. Kevin collapsed against the table, his body drained. He was 19, accused of ending the life of the girl he had loved. His absence from Nona's vigil was already sealed by this room. While others lit candles and wept in shared grief, Kevin sat under buzzing lights, watched by men who measured every tremor in his voice as deceit. Outside the room, the city began to turn its gaze. Newspapers prepared headlines. Neighbors whispered more loudly now. In their minds, the case was simple. But in the apartment across town, fragments of truth remained untouched. A condom wrapper fingerprints not belonging to Kevin. A silence that suggested another story. For now, those pieces lay dormant as Kevin's name darkened under suspicion. The night of the vigil carried the bitter chill of December. Russellville's streets were lined with flickering candles, their flames bending under the wind. Friends, classmates, neighbours, all gathered to honour the memory of a young woman whose presence had once been so bright. They spoke in whispers as if afraid to disturb the fragile silence surrounding Nona Dirksmeyer's name. Photographs of her, crowned in pageant gowns, were placed near the church steps. The images showed her smiling, radiant, full of promise. Beside them lay flowers, white lilies, roses, carnations, pressed into plastic cups of water. Each one marked the disbelief of a community forced to reckon with brutality. Voices broke as prayers were spoken. The smell of wax and damp earth lingered in the air. But among the mourners, one absence cut deeper than any candlelight could conceal. Kevin Jones was not there. His seat, should it have been reserved, remained empty. His name, spoken in hushed tones, carried weight heavier than sympathy. Some whispered that grief kept him away. Others whispered something darker, that guilt barred him from standing among them. In a small apartment not far from the vigil, Kevin sat alone. His clothes had been returned in a paper bag sealed with evidence tape. The scent of disinfectant still clung to his skin from hours inside the interrogation room. He held his phone but could not bring himself to call anyone. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Nona's body on the floor. The vigil meant to honour her life had become for him another reminder that he was no longer simply her boyfriend, he was the accused. Reporters stood at the edges of the gathering, their cameras catching tears, their pens capturing speculation. Headlines were already drafted, boyfriend absent from vigil. The story of grief had become a story of suspicion. As candles burned low and the crowd dispersed, a quiet truth hung in the night. Kevin's absence would be remembered as damning no matter his reasons. And yet, beneath the weight of rumour and accusation, evidence waited, mute, patient, ignored. A fragment of foil in the living room, a wrapper that did not belong to him, held the faint trace of another man. But for now, the community's grief narrowed into certainty: the boyfriend was guilty. In the days after Nona's death, investigators combed through the apartment, each item bagged, tagged, and logged. The scene was a jigsaw puzzle of violence, and every piece mattered. Among the lamp fragments, the knife and the blood-soaked carpet, a smaller object appeared, almost incidental: a torn condom wrapper lying near the edge of the living room. At first glance, it seemed irrelevant, the kind of discard that could be explained away by a college student's private life. Yet evidence has a language of its own. When tested, The wrapper revealed a trace of DNA male foreign and not Kevin's. Forensic science did what testimony could not. It introduced another presence into that apartment. Another man had left a mark on the scene of Nona's murder. This discovery complicated everything. Detectives had framed the case around a simple story: jealousy, rage, the boyfriend's betrayal. But the DNA unraveled that neat line of reasoning. Still, they pressed forward. They argued that the wrapper might have come from days earlier, that it bore no connection to the violence. They minimized its weight, determined to keep Kevin in the role of aggressor. Kevin's defense seized on it. Here was proof, physical and irrefutable, that someone else had been close to Nona. Someone unknown, someone unaccounted for. The wrapper became both a beacon of doubt and a quiet lifeline for Kevin. It whispered that he was not alone in this nightmare, that another shadow had moved through that apartment unseen by investigators who refused to look. But shadows rarely stand still. In time, the significance of that wrapper would grow louder. It would pull suspicion beyond Kevin and into places far darker, toward figures who walked Russellville's streets unnoticed. Men with histories of violence. Men who lived only doors away. For now, though, Kevin remained the target. His blood-stained clothes, his failed polygraph, his absence from the vigil all painted him guilty in the court of public opinion. The wrapper sat sealed in an evidence locker, waiting. Its truth was patient, but patience is often the difference between justice and silence. The prosecutors crafted their story with precision. In their telling, Kevin Jones was not a grieving boyfriend, but a young man consumed by jealousy. They described him as controlling, possessive, prone to suspicion when Nona's attention drifted elsewhere. Every argument between them was amplified, every pause in his memory portrayed as deception. They spoke of a fight of emotions boiling over in the confined walls of Nona's apartment. They suggested that Kevin had seized the lamp in anger, that its shattered base became his weapon. They said he had stabbed her in rage, then cradled her body in a desperate attempt to conceal what he had done. To the jury, they painted a vivid picture, a crime of passion, young love turned deadly. The evidence of blood on Kevin's clothing was held up as proof. The failed polygraph was repeated as fact. Even his absence from Nona's vigil was twisted into motive recast as the selfish act of a murderer unwilling to face the community. The condom wrapper, the foreign DNA, these were brushed aside, explained as irrelevant, dismissed as remnants of private behaviour with no link to the killing. Kevin sat in the courtroom, every detail of his life dissected under fluorescent lights. He remembered holding Nona for the last time, but here that memory was sharpened into a blade against him. His grief was treated as performance. His love was rewritten as violence. The jury watched with solemn faces as photographs of the crime scene were displayed. The broken lamp, the bloodstains, the knife. Each image was paired with the prosecutor's voice. Jealousy, rage, murder. Yet doubt lingered at the edges. Kevin had no history of violence. No one had seen him angry in the way the prosecution described. His mother testified to his innocence, to his horror upon discovering Nona. Friends spoke of his quiet nature, his lack of temper. The narrative was convincing, but the foundation beneath it trembled. Still, in that courtroom, truth was less important than persuasion. And persuasion leaned heavily toward Kevin's guilt. Behind the arguments, behind the carefully chosen words, one fact remained invisible to most: the real shadow that had moved through Nona's apartment had yet to be named. The trial stretched on each day, measured by testimony and cross-examination, by exhibits passed carefully from hand to hand. Kevin Jones sat in silence, his face pale under courtroom lights as witness after witness spoke. The prosecution clung to its jealousy motive, repeating it until it became rhythm. But rhythm is not truth, and doubt began to stir. The defense placed the condom wrapper before the jury. They reminded them of the DNA foreign and undeniable a fingerprint of another man's presence. They highlighted the absence of Kevin's fingerprints on the lamp and knife, the lack of any forensic evidence tying him directly to the act itself. They called experts who explained the limits of polygraph tests, the way trauma distorts memory and emotion, the unreliability of results wielded like weapons. Friends and family testified to Kevin's character. His professors described him as quiet, diligent, incapable of the fury that prosecutors had conjured. His mother spoke of that night, the knock at Nona's door, the silence, the horror when it opened. Her words trembled, but her certainty did not. Kevin had not harmed Nona. The jury listened. 12 faces, unreadable, 12 minds weighing grief against evidence. They saw the photographs of blood, the broken lamp, the knife. They heard the story of jealousy, rage and betrayal. But they also saw the gaps, the unexplained DNA, the absence of proof beyond suspicion. When deliberation ended, the courtroom held its breath. The verdict came in a single word: not guilty. Kevin's chest collapsed with the sound, not relief but exhaustion. He was acquitted, freed from the weight of a murder charge, yet freedom did not restore him. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, neighbors whispered. To many, acquittal was not innocence. His name remained tethered to Nona's death, his face fixed in their memory as the boyfriend covered in blood. He returned home not to celebration, but to silence. But the case was not closed. Somewhere in the shadows of Russellville, the truth remained hidden. The DNA on the condom wrapper was not Kevin's, and it would not stay silent forever. Another man had walked through Nona's apartment. Another man's history would soon surface. 2 years passed. Time dulled nothing. Nona's absence remained a wound, and Kevin's acquittal left the case suspended between suspicion and silence. Yet in the background, investigators continued to sift through fragments. Slowly, attention shifted not back toward Kevin, but toward a man whose proximity had always been overlooked. Gary Dunn lived near Nona's apartment. On the surface, he was unremarkable, a neighbour, a man whose name blended into the anonymous rhythms of Russellville life. But when investigators probed deeper, his history surfaced like rot beneath water. Dunn had a record of assault violence against women, a reputation whispered among those who had known him. He was not a stranger to brutality. Police reports described incidents with chilling detail, sudden outbursts, women struck without warning, threats muttered in anger. His former wife had fled his grip, leaving behind a marriage stained with fear. Yet, when Nona was murdered, his presence had barely been noted, his name no louder than background noise. The DNA on the condom wrapper shifted the narrative. It did not belong to Kevin. Forensic comparison traced it instead to Gary Dunn. Suddenly, the unremarkable neighbour became the centre of gravity. His proximity to Nona's home, his violent past, his unexplained connection to the wrapper, all formed a picture far more compelling than jealousy. Detectives pieced together his movements, his timeline, his access. Neighbours recalled seeing him near the apartment. Others remembered small details: a door closing late at night, footsteps in the stairwell. None of it was enough to prove guilt, but together, the fragments cast a shadow that reached directly into Nona's living room. In the public eye, Kevin's face began to fade, replaced by the outline of Dunn. The story shifted, newspapers running new headlines, whispers taking new shape. The neighbour, not the boyfriend. But suspicion is not conviction. To secure justice, investigators would need testimony that revealed not just opportunity but character. And character would be revealed most clearly by the woman who had once known him best. The courtroom was hushed as Gary Dunn's ex-wife took the stand. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone, her voice low but steady. What she carried into that room was not speculation or rumour. It was memory, carved deep by years of fear. She described a marriage built on intimidation. She told of nights when Gary's temper ignited without warning, when words gave way to fists, when threats hung in the air long after the shouting stopped. She spoke of eyes that could harden suddenly a man whose violence needed no provocation. The jury leaned forward, each word another stone laid into the path of suspicion. Her testimony did not stand alone. Others came forward with accounts of his volatility. Neighbours recalled arguments, sudden outbursts that ended with slammed doors and silence. Former acquaintances described a man who carried darkness beneath a veneer of ordinariness. These stories painted a portrait of someone for whom brutality was not unimaginable but familiar. The condom wrapper tied him to Nona's apartment. The ex-wife's words tied him to a pattern of cruelty. Prosecutors built their case piece by piece, showing not only opportunity but character. Gary Dunn was no longer just a neighbour. He was a man capable of the act that had taken Nona's life. Yet trials are not only battles of fact, but of perception. The defence attacked credibility, questioned memory, suggested exaggeration. They argued that anger in a marriage did not prove murder in an apartment. They reminded the jury that no fingerprints of Dunn's were lifted from the lamp, no eyewitness placed him inside Nona's living room. Doubt became their weapon, and doubt is often enough. When the jury withdrew, the courtroom held its breath. Hours passed. When they returned, the verdict was not relief but deadlock. The jury could not agree. Some believed Dunn guilty, others held to uncertainty. The gavel fell, and with it justice slipped again into shadow. For Nona's family, the outcome was another wound. For Kevin, still marked by suspicion, it was another reminder that truth remained elusive. And for Dunn, it was freedom bought not by innocence, but by doubt. Yet even in that courtroom where words clashed and verdicts faltered, subtle details waited, breadcrumbs unnoticed, left by someone who had always seemed harmless. Long before Gary Dunn's name reached headlines, another presence had lingered quietly at the edges of this story. They had been there in the early hours, when Kevin's grief was first recorded, when the apartment filled with investigators, when evidence was bagged and sealed. They had spoken softly, helpfully, their role unthreatening. Few remembered their face in detail, and fewer still questioned their words. Yet in silence, they left behind small clues, breadcrumbs, that would only later gain their true weight. There was the remark, almost casual, about the lamp. Strange that it broke so clean. The observation slipped easily into conversation. But how could they know the fracture without studying it closely? There was the way they described Nona's last known movements with more precision than the police had yet released a detail dismissed at the time as harmless speculation. A notebook appeared in their possession lists, Times notes jotted in cramped handwriting. Officially, it was explained as diligence, as someone trying to keep track to help. Yet among the scribbles lay references to objects in Nona's apartment that had not been publicly disclosed. When asked later, they claimed to have overheard it. No one pressed further. The community, eager for resolution, directed all suspicion toward Kevin, then toward Dunn. The helpful presence faded into the background, their steady calm overlooked amid the chaos of accusation. They attended the vigil unlike Kevin. They comforted mourners unlike Dunn. They seemed safe, almost invisible. And invisibility is the most dangerous mask of all. Years later, when evidence was re-examined, when fragments of testimony were compared, the threads began to align. Their phrases, their notes, their proximity, each became part of a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. What had seemed like kindness revealed itself as something else, knowledge that should not have been theirs, an intimacy with the crime that no bystander could claim. By then, the case had hardened into stalemate. Trials had ended, verdicts had failed. The window for justice narrowed with every year. But the breadcrumbs remained a trail pointing toward the unassuming figure who had moved unnoticed through the grief of Russellville, carrying the weight of truth beneath a mask of quiet helpfulness. When the threads finally converged, the portrait was not of Gary Dunn, the violent neighbour, nor of Kevin Jones, the grieving boyfriend. It was of someone far quieter, someone who had walked among mourners and investigators without suspicion. Their presence had always seemed benign. A helping hand, a sympathetic listener, a figure who collected details under the guise of concern. But the breadcrumbs were undeniable. They knew too much too soon. They remarked on evidence before it was shared. Their notebook contained fragments that only the killer could have noticed. The realization came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow tightening of the air. Evil had not hidden in a jealous outburst, nor in the shadow of a neighbour's violent history. It had hidden in plain sight beneath a calm exterior, behind familiar eyes. Yet by the time those breadcrumbs were recognised, the system had already hardened. Kevin had been tried and acquitted. Dunn had faced the jury and walked away under a hung verdict. The quiet figure who slipped through both nets had never been named, never been charged. They remained free, their identity blurred by time and silence. For Nona's family, the wound remains unhealed. For Kevin, suspicion never fully lifted. For Russellville, the case became less about resolution and more about endurance. The endurance of grief, of whispers of questions without answers. Justice did not arrive. The truth never stood in court. And yet the story of Nona Dirksmeyer holds a lesson that lingers like the cold air of that December night. Evil is not always loud nor obvious. It does not always wear the face of rage. Sometimes it wears the face of familiarity, the mask of helpfulness, the calm of someone we think we can trust. As they walked away from the courthouse for the last time, Kevin looked at the building one last time. The real journey was just beginning. In the end, that was the lesson. Evil might hide behind familiar faces, but love endures. Memory endures. Truth endures. As they moved toward their new future, Kevin squeezed his mother's hand. "I'm scared it will never end." It will. One day at a time. They stepped toward healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.